before she was Hollywood's peroxide whirlwind, the darling of Technicolor musicals and the firecracker who lit up every soundstage she entered, Betty Hutton was just a skinny little girl with big eyes, a bigger mouth, and a voice loud enough to cut through the depression fog that blanketed working-class Detroit. She was born Elizabeth June Thornburg on February 26, 1921, into a world already steeped in chaos. Her father, a railroad foreman, walked out when Betty was just a toddler. It wasn't the slow fade of a broken marriage. No, he slammed the door and never looked back. Years later, Betty would say she remembered him only as a shadow at the end of a hallway, an echo of abandonment that would haunt every relationship she ever had. Her mother, Mabel, was a steel-nerved, cigar-chomping survivor. Left alone with 2 daughters to feed and no formal education, Mabel turned to bootlegging. This was prohibition after all, and she ran an illegal speakeasy out of the family kitchen. Betty grew up around backroom card games, whiskey bottles tucked under floorboards, and a revolving cast of desperate characters. If you asked Betty, she'd tell you she learned to perform by singing over the shouting of drunks and clinking of glasses in that makeshift saloon. Her mother encouraged it, not out of maternal tenderness, but because a little girl belting out songs could distract the cops if they ever came sniffing around. And they did. Often. By the time she was a teenager, Betty had already mastered the art of attention-getting. She dyed her hair peroxide blonde, slathered on red lipstick, and threw herself into amateur singing contests with the ferocity of a woman twice her age. She wasn't conventionally beautiful. Her features were too angular, her energy too intense. But that's what made her unforgettable. When she opened her mouth to sing, you didn't just listen, you watched her. And that was exactly the point. She started hustling gigs wherever she could. Roller rinks, dive bars, army canteens, and then the golden ticket. She landed a singing job with Vincent Lopez's orchestra, one of the top big bands of the day. It was 1938. Betty was just 17, living in a cheap hotel in New York City, eating canned beans and rehearsing like her life depended on it. Because it did. She brought something raw and uncontainable to the stage. A manic, almost cartoonish energy that felt like Lucille Ball had swallowed Ethel Merman. She jitterbugged, she howled, she mugged for the crowd, and somehow made it all feel like magic. Audiences didn't know what to make of her, but they remembered her. And in show business, that's half the battle. By the early 1940s, Betty was hustling her way into radio programs and small-time vaudeville circuits. She was relentless. She'd camp outside casting offices for hours, sneak into audition lines she wasn't called for, and shamelessly name-drop people she'd only met once. She was hungry, desperate even, and in Depression-era America, that kind of drive either got you labeled as difficult or destined. In Betty's case, it got her noticed by none other than Buddy DeSilva, a hotshot producer at Paramount Pictures. He saw her perform and was struck by her sheer force of personality. She was loud, she was brash, she was unpredictable, and he knew Hollywood had never seen anything like her. By 1942, Betty Hutton was under contract with Paramount and being groomed as the next big thing. But let's be clear, this wasn't the carefully curated starlet treatment reserved for glamour girls like Veronica Lake or Hedy Lamarr. Paramount didn't try to smooth Betty's edges. They weaponized them. She was billed as the blonde bombshell with the machine gun vibrato. And that voice? It was a force of nature. Screechy, brassy, thrilling, like a trumpet being played by a caffeinated banshee. You either loved it or you fled the room. Either way, Betty had your attention. Her breakout moment came in the musical The Fleet's Inn, alongside Dorothy Lamour and William Holden. And with that, Betty went from unknown oddity to full-fledged movie star. But behind the scenes, she was still that scrappy kid from the bootleg kitchen. Nervous, insecure, and always terrified that the spotlight would blink off just as fast as it had blinked on. She pushed herself mercilessly, over-rehearsing, micromanaging every note, every line, every expression. Directors said she was exhausting. Co-stars said she was chaotic. But the cameras loved her, and so did the box office. Little did anyone know, the very qualities that made Betty Hutton unforgettable, her mania, her hunger, her refusal to be ignored, would also be the same ones that would eventually unravel her. But for now, she was flying, higher than she'd ever imagined. And with the full force of Paramount Pictures behind her, Betty Hutton wasn't just going to become a star. She was going to explode. By 1944, Betty Hutton was the IT girl of Paramount Pictures. Not in the same way as your classic icy bombshells, though. Betty wasn't sipping champagne in mink stoles or seducing men with a whisper. She was cartwheeling across sound stages, shrieking high notes and bouncing with enough kinetic energy to put the Looney Tunes to shame. While other starlets tried to master the art of mystery, Betty mastered the art of being undeniable. Her breakout continued with hit after hit. In The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, she played Trudy Cockenlocker, a name that alone should tell you how wild the role was. The film was a preposterous wartime comedy about a young woman who gets pregnant after a drunken party and can't remember who the father is. Scandalous? Absolutely. But under director Preston Sturges' whip-smart script and Betty's zany performance, it became a box office smash. In fact, critics raved that Betty had single-handedly turned outrageous into adorable. No one else could have gotten away with Trudy's antics. She made chaos look like choreography, and foolishness look like fun. Then came Annie Get Your Gun. But let's rewind just a bit, because getting that iconic role wasn't smooth sailing. The film was a big-budget MGM musical with songs by Irving Berlin and the kind of prestige that could define a career. It was originally going to star the already beloved Judy Garland. In fact, Judy had filmed multiple scenes before MGM. Citing her exhaustion and ongoing personal troubles, pulled the plug on her participation. Enter Betty Hutton, Paramount's crown jewel, now loaned out to MGM for one very expensive gamble. She knew the stakes. Judy Garland wasn't just any star. She was the voice of a generation. Replacing her was either going to be a triumph or a travesty. But Betty knocked it out of the park. Her Annie Oakley wasn't soft or girlish. She was a hollering, headstrong whirlwind with a rifle in one hand and a punchline in the other. The songs became instant classics. There's No Business Like Show Business practically became Betty's theme song, and the film was a mega hit. Betty was no longer just a star. She was a phenomenon. For several years running, she was among the top 10 box office draws in America, competing with the likes of Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. Paramount flooded the screens with Hutton vehicles. The Perils of Pauline, Happy-Go-Lucky, Incendiary Blonde, and Let's Dance. Each one louder, brighter, and more energetically choreographed than the last. She had the ear of powerful studio execs, the admiration of audiences, and the money to back it up. At her peak, she was making more than $150,000 a year, an astronomical sum in the 1940s, and was one of the highest-paid women in America. And yet, for all the applause, Betty was deeply, painfully insecure. You see, the same thing that fueled her comedic brilliance, her frantic, jittery energy, wasn't just an act. Betty lived in a constant state of emotional overdrive. She didn't trust compliments. She was convinced people were laughing at her, not with her. And in a world of ice-cool glamour girls and demure leading ladies, Betty felt like a wild animal at a tea party. Even her so-called friends in the industry treated her like a novelty act. They marveled at her energy, but rarely respected her craft. She wasn't viewed as a serious actress. She was that crazy blonde, that loud girl, that screamer. This internalized sense of otherness grew like a shadow behind every curtain call. Off-camera, Betty was demanding, not diva demanding, desperate demanding. She needed reassurance constantly. She drove directors up the wall with endless questions about blocking, line delivery, and costume choices. She pored over her own recordings, critiquing every facial twitch, every missed beat. She wasn't just trying to be good, she was trying to prove she deserved to be there. And then came the worst betrayal of all. Paramount turned on her. It wasn't overnight. These things never are. But in the late 1940s, Betty's brand of slapstick fizz and musical antics began to lose steam. The studio heads, always looking for the next hot face, began to sideline her in favor of newer, glossier talent. When Betty tried to push for more control, choosing scripts, approving directors, Paramount shut her down. She'd been a money machine, yes, but she wasn't serious enough to demand that kind of power. Not like Audrey Hepburn or Barbara Stanwyck. And so Betty did the unthinkable. She walked. In 1952, she left Paramount in a fiery, defiant blaze, convinced she could make it on her own. She formed her own production company and began shopping around for dramatic roles. something to show she could do more than sing and scream. But Hollywood has a short memory and an even shorter attention span. Without a studio machine behind her, Betty became a has-been almost overnight. Her big dramatic turn, Spring Reunion, 1957, was a box office flop. Critics panned her performance, some calling it overacted, others calling it a waste of her comedic gift. The film failed to resurrect her career, and Betty began to fade from the silver screen. But perhaps the most heartbreaking twist? Betty Hutton had fought her way out of poverty, survived the booze-soaked speakeasy days, conquered radio, stage, and film, and yet at the height of her fame, she still couldn't find peace. She was beloved by millions, but to herself, she never quite felt enough. The show wasn't over, but the curtain had started to wobble, and the golden girl of musical comedy was about to enter the darkest act of her life. The 1950s should have been Betty Hutton's victory lap. She had done it all, topped the box office, conquered Broadway, and even beat Judy Garland to one of MGM's biggest roles. But instead of basking in legacy, Betty entered the decade like a shooting star out of fuel. Brilliant, yes, but burning too fast and falling faster. Her exit from Paramount had left her professionally adrift. Hollywood is not known for mercy, and without a studio's backing, Betty was seen as risky. Difficult, damaged goods. The same agents and producers who once begged for her time now avoided her calls. Desperate to reshape her image, Betty poured her money and reputation into producing Spring Reunion, a dramatic film about two high school sweethearts reuniting decades after graduation. She wanted subtlety, emotion, depth, but the critics weren't buying it. The reviews were ice cold. The New York Times called it a reunion best left unplanned, and audiences didn't show up. With that single flop, her dreams of being a serious actress evaporated. Then came the personal freefall. Betty had always been high-strung, a bundle of nerves, energy, and anxiety. But as the career offers dried up and her name faded from the marquee, she began to unravel. She struggled with prescription pills, a common Hollywood epidemic in those days, especially for women expected to stay skinny, energized, and emotionally on at all times. She also battled with alcohol, using it to mute the disappointment and loneliness that now clung to her daily life. The Betty Hutton the world saw, bright, brassy, electric, was now a woman fighting to get out of bed. Worse, she had never developed the kind of personal relationships that could ground her. She was on husband number 4, and each marriage had unraveled in its own uniquely painful way. Her need for emotional security clashed with a fierce independence that often alienated those around her. She loved hard, but she also panicked when people got too close. In her own words, "I always had one foot out the door." Her final marriage to jazz trumpeter Pete Condoli began like a whirlwind, romantic, musical, passionate, but ended in chaos. He couldn't keep up with her emotional volatility, and she couldn't cope with his growing resentment. The two had a daughter together, but even motherhood couldn't fill the widening void in Betty's life. By the early 1960s, she was broke. Not metaphorically, truly, devastatingly broke. She had squandered most of her fortune trying to revive her career, fund personal projects, and support a lavish lifestyle that no longer matched her dwindling income. The IRS came knocking. Her Beverly Hills mansion was gone. The friends and fans? Mostly gone too. The star, who had once been America's most bankable blonde bombshell, was now living in seedy motels and friends' spare rooms, often too ashamed to even show her face in public. She'd walk into supermarkets and hear people whisper, "Wasn't that Betty Hutton?" But no one was quite sure because she barely looked like herself anymore. In a moment of desperation, she even tried to end her life. The details remain fuzzy. Betty never spoke publicly about the exact incident, but those close to her confirmed she had sunk into a pit so dark she could no longer see the way out. She survived, but she was done with Hollywood. And then, like something out of a script no one would dare write, Betty Hutton vanished. Literally. She disappeared from the industry, the spotlight, and the public. For nearly a decade, no one knew where she had gone. Rumors swirled. Some said she was in a rehab facility. Others believed she had moved to Europe. A few whispered she was working under an alias, too embarrassed to face her old life. The tabloids speculated but never confirmed. For all intents and purposes, Betty Hutton, the legend, the star, the tornado in lipstick, had ceased to exist. But Betty wasn't dead. She had simply gone somewhere no one expected, to a Catholic convent in Rhode Island. There, under the guidance of a priest who had shown her kindness, Betty converted to Catholicism, embraced a life of religious devotion, and began working, not as a nun, but as a cook and housekeeper for the nuns. This wasn't a stunt, it wasn't a media grab. It was the only place she'd found peace. For years, she scrubbed floors, prepared meals, and prayed, genuinely. And when asked why someone who once sang to millions had given it all up for cleaning duties and daily mass, Betty would simply say, "They loved me here. No one wanted anything from me." But as with all great stars, the pull of the past is never too far away. In the 1970s, a few reporters caught wind of her whereabouts. The New York Times published a story about the strange journey of Betty Hutton, from Hollywood's highest-paid comedian to a convent cook. Interest flickered again. Not long after, Betty made a few cautious returns to the public eye. She appeared on The Mike Douglas Show, gave a rare interview to Good Morning America, and eventually starred in a one-woman show about her life. But the spark was different. Softer, older, less desperate to be loved, more eager to be understood. In her later years, she taught acting at Emerson College in Boston. Students described her as intense, passionate, and heartbreaking. Still the same Betty, just with more miles on her soul. She spent her final decades mostly in obscurity, living modestly, tending to her faith, and occasionally speaking to fans who hadn't forgotten. And when she passed away in 2007 at the age of 86, the headlines were bittersweet. Hollywood's forgotten starlet, Betty Hutton, the original blonde tornado, she could have had it all. But here's the truth. She did have it all. Fame, fortune, talent, applause. What she didn't have was the safety net Hollywood never built for its brightest stars. She lit up the sky, but no one thought to catch her when she fell. Betty Hutton was more than a scream, more than a song, more than a slapstick punchline. She was a survivor, a fighter, a firecracker. And sometimes, when the world got too dark, she exploded. Not for attention, but just to feel alive. She came into the world screaming, and she never really stopped. Betty Hutton didn't whisper her way through life. She shouted, sang, danced, and demanded to be seen. For a while, Hollywood couldn't get enough of her. She was Technicolor energy in a black and white world, a live wire in a city of puppets, the girl with the $1 million smile and the nerves of dynamite. But the very spark that made her irresistible also made her impossible to contain. She burned too hot, too fast, and when the applause faded, the silence nearly destroyed her. Betty didn't leave the spotlight gracefully. She was exiled from it, chewed up by a system that never knew what to do with a woman who wouldn't shut up, slow down, or apologize for taking up space. And yet, she didn't vanish. Not really. Even in her darkest moments, she held on to some sliver of that starburst soul. Betty Hutton may have died far from the Hollywood dream she once embodied, but her legend remains defiant, chaotic, and utterly unforgettable. Because some stars don't fade. They explode, loud, wild, and spectacular, leaving behind a glow we still see today. Betty Hutton was one of them. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her laughing.